The most famous passage in 1 Corinthians is one of the most famous parts of the Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is all about love, and it's very often read out at weddings. So 1 Corinthians is in the New Testament. Here we are. So the letters of Paul are collected together in the New Testament. Romans is first and 1 Corinthians comes directly after that. Paul is really important for the New Testament. So he wrote several books of the New Testament. He was someone who originally was antagonistic toward Christianity and then had a dramatic experience where he says he encountered the risen Jesus. He wrote letters to the churches that he had founded, and those letters are now in our New Testament.
A Corinthian is really a person who belongs to the city of Corinth, which was a really powerful and flourishing city, a bit like modern cultures today, which are entrepreneurial, full of business links, humming with activity, lots of tourists, about the fourth or fifth city of the Roman Empire. Well, that's me standing on what is called the Lyceum Road. It's one of the main exits and entrances to Corinth, and in the background is the mountain of Acrocorinth, which provided a citadel for the city of Corinth, and it added to their sense of importance and security, that it really was a sort of grade 1 place to be.
Paul wrote several letters to churches in Corinth, and in the New Testament we have 2 of those letters. The first one, 1 Corinthians or 1 Corinthians, the second one, 2 or 2 Corinthians, and they were written in that order, but there were probably other letters that he wrote to them as well, and that they wrote to him.
Oh yes, well that's quite funny, because although it's called 1 Corinthians, it actually says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I wrote to you in my letter, and that means there was a letter before 1 Corinthians. Paul is writing to a young church in the city of Corinth, where there were numerous problems. There were splits, for example. There was a lack of belief by some in the resurrection. But in my view, there actually is a common link between all these diverse problems, which is that we nowadays say the Corinthians were full of themselves. They thought they could be Christians in a distinctively Corinthian way. And so Paul deals with a host of problems which basically attacks self-centeredness.
One of the things about the letters of Paul is that they are all occasional letters. In other words, they all arise from particular occasions and situations. So Paul's talking to particular people. This was written about the mid-50s of the first century, and in a particular location, Corinth.
We're very fortunate about being able to date 1 Corinthians because there's a parallel account in the Acts of the Apostles, another book of the Bible, which tells us that Paul appeared before a Roman proconsul called Gallio. And Roman documents date exactly when Gallio was proconsul, around about AD 52, and Paul would then have written back the letter about 18 months afterwards. So we can pretty certainly date it 53 or early 54. There's no doubt about that. It's such an important date being attested, being shown by Roman documents, that it's really the linchpin for dating the books of the New Testament.
The most famous passage in 1 Corinthians is one of the most famous parts of the Bible. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So it's obviously a wonderful celebration of what real love is. One thing that's interesting though, if you read the rest of 1 Corinthians, is that all of these things that Paul is saying love is, are the very same things that he's saying the Corinthians are not. So actually, when this was first read out to the Corinthian church, I think it would have been a painful thing to hear. It was designed to provoke and to make them say, ouch. So when he says love is patient, love is kind, he's already told the Corinthians that they're not being patient and kind with one another. When it says love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude, he said at numerous points throughout the letter that those Corinthians are being boastful and constantly being arrogant with one another. In all of these things, he's saying love is what you aren't. So in its original setting, I think it wouldn't have immediately been used in weddings.
It's quite wrong to think of Paul as somebody who's always denouncing and always aggressive. On the contrary, there's a lot to congratulate the Corinthians about, but he doesn't let them get away with everything. He shows where they can improve.
You can still visit Corinth today. There's now New Corinth, which is obviously the new settlement, and ancient Corinth is a little bit more inland, and you can still see the ruins of ancient Corinth there. So I've been there. There's quite a lot to see. You can see the ancient temple of Apollo that was there. You can see the ancient theatre where they used to have gladiator-style fights during the Roman period. And so those things really do illuminate the book of 1 Corinthians, because Paul talks about what you buy in the marketplace. He talks about how there are temples and what he calls idols. One thing that's really interesting in ancient Corinth is there's a pavement that's inscribed with the words, well, it says this in Latin, this pavement was placed by Erastus. So it's known as the Erastus pavement. Now, Paul mentions someone called Erastus living in Corinth. He mentions that actually in his letter to the Romans. So perhaps it's the same Erastus. People are not sure, but it might be the same Erastus.
I spent a fortnight there and looked at all the archaeological sites. The archaeological sites are amazing.
I was pretty excited, and so I was racing around with my camera, just constantly taking photos of everything I saw. One of the things that I've tried to imagine is what would Corinth have been like to people who were living there in the middle of the 1st century when 1 Corinthians was written. And you get some sense of that by looking at the ancient site. But what I've been trying to do is to recreate some of those buildings just virtually on the computer, so that you can have a little virtual tour of Corinth to see what it looked like when the buildings were actually properly standing rather than being rubble and ruins. And so that's been, it's been fun mucking around with that on the computer, just trying to piece together what things might have looked like 2,000 years ago.
Yes, I've written actually 2 commentaries. There's a commentary on the Greek text, because Paul wrote in Greek, which is 1,500 pages, and a pretty massive thing for specialists. And then my wife said to me, what's the good of just writing for specialists? Write something that everybody can understand. So I then wrote, 5 years later, a smaller book of about it's nearly 300 pages. This is the thickness of 1 Corinthians in the Bible, pages 157 of the New Testament to page 170 of the New Testament, 13 pages, yes. So it is a bit ridiculous that that commentary is all on about 13 pages, but it just shows how much there is to say about the epistle.